In the middle of the Arizona desert, where summer temperatures can climb past 100 degrees Fahrenheit and the landscape is brutally unforgiving, there was once a place dedicated entirely to Christmas. And not just during December, not even just for the season, but all year long. That's right, for decades, families pulled off the highway to find what appeared to be snow-dusted buildings, candy cane decorations, in a town that promised something entirely out of place. Santa Claus himself waiting in the desert heat. And it wouldn't take long for word of this bizarre attraction to spread across the nation as children mailed letters postmarked from Santa Claus, Arizona, meaning, for a while at least, this village became one of the most recognizable roadside attractions in the American Southwest. But as you might imagine, Christmas isn't really meant to last beyond a season, and St. Nick probably should have stayed home back in the North Pole, because this venture rapidly developed into a financial disaster. For starters, building a Christmas town in the middle of a desert came with problems no amount of tinsel could solve. We're talking immense travel distances, dangerous heat, and the ever-changing habits of our modern day. Over time, the crowds thinned, the decorations faded, and Santa Claus, Arizona slowly slipped off the map, literally. So how did this Depression-era attraction come to be? Why did it fall, and what remains? Stay tuned to find out as we explore the rise and fall of Santa Claus, Arizona. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. Now, to understand how Santa Claus, Arizona came to exist at all, we have to rewind to a moment in time when America desperately needed a bit of a morale boost. In many ways, the early 20th century was a time of stress. Industrialization had uprooted traditional life, cities were swelling, and by the time the Great Depression hit, optimism had become a scarce commodity. This was understandable as families had less money, fewer guarantees, and very little certainty about the future. And yet for many, Christmas endured as a symbolic yearly oasis. And I need to emphasize here that by the 1920s and 30s, that day had already transformed from a strictly religious tradition into a commercialized spectacle. Department stores built elaborate window displays, newspapers ran seasonal advertisements weeks in advance, whereas radio, which was still relatively new technology at the time, carried what we now call Christmas music into millions of homes. What's also worth noting here is just how differently Christmas music functioned back then. Many of the songs that we now label as classics were branded as new in the 1930s, written specifically for radio, sheet music sales, and live performances. In other words, the public enjoyed them, as they weren't yet trapped in that decade-long forced repetition. Furthermore, there were no standardized holiday playlists, no retail sound systems looping the same recording for hours on end. So, while most of us might groan when we hear Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas for the 1000th time, early audiences experienced their Christmas songs as fresh and tied to a sense of comfort, not fatigue. And this was important because as the commercialization was fresh, Christmas wasn't as taxing as it is today. Beyond that, this was also the era when Santa Claus finally crystallized into his modern form, which is an absolutely crucial point for our story. You see, a soft drink company of all things, Coca-Cola, needed a type of marketing icon that could transcend their product into a custom. And surprisingly, they chose St. Nicholas, a 4th century bishop from what's now southern Turkey, with the intention of transforming his image. You see, that original St. Nicholas had very little in common with what we know as Santa Claus. For starters, the real St. Nicholas lived in the Roman Empire, not the North Pole. Contemporary accounts describe him as stern, disciplined, and intensely moral. Additionally, he was said to be more concerned with justice than cheer, though there were some similarities. For example, he was known for anonymous generosity. He also enforced standards of behavior, especially among children. You know, be good and you'll get presents, or be bad and you'll get coal. Hence, the point I'm trying to make here is that the modern Santa Claus that Coca-Cola invented is kind of a far stretch from the historical saint. Rather, Santa Claus is a cultural invention based on an older religious figure. And to make that concept work, Coca-Cola had to completely repackage and soften St. Nicholas's image to meet the emotional needs of the modern American public. With the new packaging in place, Christmas wasn't just a religious day anymore, Rather, it became a emotional product. And for some Americans, including one Arizona resident, that mattered deeply. Okay, guys, I updated the set so that it feels a little bit more festive. I realized, like, halfway into recording this that the studio wasn't exactly up to speed, but since I have my kids' Christmas presents here, voila. All right, on with the story. Nina Talbot, along with her husband Edward, had arrived in the Kingman, Arizona area at the tail end of the Great Depression. And like many Americans, they were looking for stability. And the couple was surprisingly successful, as early on they operated a roadside motel, placing them directly inside the growing economy of automobile travel. One important factor stood out to them. As they watched families pass through, they realized that the monotony of the desert left tourists unusually receptive to novelty. In other words, they understood that the highway itself could create a major opportunity. However, they had to find a way to make travelers stop. And they weren't the only ones who noticed this. For context, themed roadside attractions were becoming increasingly common across the country, and entrepreneurs used things like dinosaur sculptures, castles, and odd landmarks to grab people's attention. And for reasons unknown, out of all the things they could have chosen, in 1937, Nina and her husband decided to set Santa Claus up in the middle of the desert. And apparently, everyone who passed by reacted. And as they did, this bizarre Santa Claus set evolved. The first buildings in Santa Claus, Arizona appeared just off the highway. They were simple structures dressed in unmistakable holiday imagery. There was a Santa Claus workshop at the center and storybook-style houses surrounding it. At first, travelers stopped out of curiosity, but as word spread, they actually started heading into the middle of the desert with the sole intention of visiting the town. In fact, visitor volume grew so rapidly that the Santa Claus post office soon became the town's defining feature. There, letters addressed simply to Santa Claus arrived from across the country and sometimes beyond, especially during the holiday season. Each of these letters were stamped, answered, and returned with an official Santa Claus, Arizona postmark. And this is important, as that small detail is what turned a roadside stop into a national presence. Naturally, as foot traffic increased, the couple expanded their empire further. Next, the Santa Claus Inn opened to accommodate travelers who wanted to stay longer. It served both as a lodge and a restaurant, and it quickly gained a reputation that exceeded expectations. Nina actually worked in the kitchen herself, and visitors frequently remarked on the quality of the food, particularly her rum pie, which became locally famous. Though what often gets overlooked is that Santa Claus, Arizona was never meant to stand alone. Rather, the couple saw themselves as aspiring real estate developers. Their flagship would be the Christmas village itself, which at the time occupied only a small portion of the land, but the remaining acreage was to be the real prize. The idea was straightforward. Use high visibility, emotionally attract travelers to pull off the highway, but then convert their attention into long-term growth. They thought if Santa Claus could bring people to the desert, some of them might want to stay. And if they did stay, they'd become residents, buy property, open businesses, and build an actual town named Santa Claus, Arizona around this attraction. In that sense, the Christmas village was not the end goal. It never was. It was just the hook. For a while, it worked exactly as planned, at least on the surface. By the 1940s, Santa Claus, Arizona had settled into a steady rhythm. But this surface success had a major flaw. Santa Claus, Arizona could draw people off the highway, yes, but it never managed to convert them into permanent residents. The settlement never really emerged, and in the long run, that difference would decide its fate. By the late 1940s, the limits of Santa Claus, Arizona became apparent. Sure, the Christmas village still attracted visitors, letters still arrived, and the inn still served guests, but the larger plan, the one that justified the entire concept, had stalled completely. In fact, the entirety of the surrounding land remained unsold. What the Talbots had hoped would become a permanent settlement never materialized, and once they accepted that reality, they exited the situation fast. By 1949, just 12 years after opening Santa Claus, Arizona, they sold off the property, and the town entered a different phase. The Christmas theme remained, but the development vision disappeared. The Santa Claus Inn was renamed to the Christmas Tree Inn, and the village shifted from long-term ambitions to simple short-term survival. Surprisingly, Throughout all this, the restaurant maintained a good reputation well into the early 1950s, to the point that on some occasions it hosted well-known guests, including actress Jane Russell, who reportedly had a dinner party there. So even without the founders, Santa Claus, Arizona lingered in American pop culture, and it was also written about. For example, one author featured the setting for his short story, Cliff and the Calories. Food critics revered it, and travel writers continued to mention it as a curiosity worth seeing. But beneath the surface of all that greatness, instability grew. Throughout the 1960s, the property changed hands repeatedly. Each new owner floated new ideas of expansion or reinvention, but few were realized. Ultimately, throughout this, maintenance slipped, infrastructure aged, and without constant investment, the village lost its charm. Moreover, the external forces didn't help. Basically, the interstate highway system prioritized speed over stops, so families drove faster with fewer interruptions to the point that once thriving roadside attractions found themselves bypassed through new networks. In response, later owners leaned heavily on the town's most reliable asset, the mail. National advertisements promoted a remailing service that allowed children's letters to be answered from Santa Claus directly, with that official postmark of Santa Claus, Arizona. And so, through those services, the business carried on for a time, even without the families visiting. However, that would not last forever either. By the 1970s, they finally threw in the towel. Santa Claus, Arizona was removed from state maps, buildings fell into disrepair, and this weird piece of Americana entered abandonment. In the early 1980s, then owner Tony Wilcox attempted to sell the property. His asking price was $95,000 for the 4 acres, but the highest offer he received was only $50,000, and he turned it down. He returned to that Christmas theme that had worked for so many decades. Some buildings were repainted with peppermint designs, but the effort came too little, too late. And as the 80s were coming to a close, travel writers began describing Santa Claus, Arizona as abandoned in all but name. It now featured padlocked buildings, burned out lights, and sand drifting through empty rooms. In 1995, the village was officially closed. And this failure is hard to pinpoint. Santa Claus, Arizona didn't fail because people stopped believing in Christmas. Rather, it failed because belief alone wasn't enough to keep the town alive. And for years after that, the site sat untouched. Now, through this decline, it became a new type of mythical destination. It wasn't Santa Claus's workshop in the desert anymore. Rather, the tagline became Santa's abandoned workshop in the desert. And if you clicked on this video or others that I produced, I suppose that you understand that appeal. And it went on like this. By the 2000s, the ghost town had re-entered public awareness through a short film titled 50 Years Later. The filmmaker featured contrasting footage from 1956 when his family visited, with images of the site half a century later. The emotional weight of this urban decay, shown in the then and now style, was stark. A place once filled with children was now reduced to decay. The film went on to receive recognition at the 2007 Northwest Film and Video Festival. And although this reemergence was romantic indeed, what happened next would firmly mark the end of the story. In 2022, the state of Arizona elected to raze the site entirely. By that point, the buildings were abandoned for years. Exposure to extreme heat, wind, and sand had left many of them structurally unsound. The walls were collapsing, roofs were falling in, and the village now posed a real safety liability. There were also practical concerns here, since the abandoned structures attracted trespassers, vandals, and curiosity seekers, who more often than not were up to no good. So, with no viable plan for restoration or preservation, officials determined that removing the remaining buildings was safer than allowing them to continue their deterioration. So they were demolished, and once the structures were cleared, the land was left to return to its natural state. So that's the story of Santa Claus, Arizona. I hope you enjoyed it. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off. And of course, wishing you a Merry Christmas. Want your present? Here we go. Are you surprised? I didn't tear it because I still got stuff to wrap. Anyways, see you guys.